They took my late husband's snowplow while I was out of town for 3 days. Just hauled it off my driveway like it was an abandoned shopping cart, slapped a warning notice on my mailbox, and figured an old widow wouldn't do a thing about it. 30 days later, their entire neighborhood was sitting in the dark with no water. Now, before anybody jumps to conclusions, let me tell you something. I didn't start that fight. I'm 70 years old, retired, and for the most part one like quiet mornings, library books, and feeding the birds behind my house. I'm not the kind of woman who looks for trouble. But when people start acting like they own land that isn't theirs, well, sometimes the only thing you can do is remind them exactly where the property lines are. My name is Eleanor Whitaker. I live outside a little place called Maple Ridge, Minnesota, about an hour north of Minneapolis. It's one of those lake communities developers love to build these days. Neat little rows of identical houses, gray siding, big windows, perfectly trimmed lawns that look like they were measured with a ruler. 60 homes in total. Every driveway has a shiny SUV or a Tesla parked in it. Every mailbox matches, and every porch light is the same soft yellow glow that probably came out of some design catalog. Except for mine. My house sits at the very edge of the neighborhood, a little older, a little crooked around the edges, painted this faded sunflower yellow that my husband chose back in 1982. The paint's peeling now, the porch creaks when you step on the third board from the left, and the cedar siding smells like summer even in the middle of winter. Most of the neighbors don't like it much. They say it doesn't fit the aesthetic. Personally, I think that's a fancy way of saying it reminds them this land had a life before their subdivision brochures. My husband, Daniel, bought the property back when none of this existed yet. Back then it was just woods, lake water, and a narrow dirt road that turned into mud every spring. He worked construction most of his life, big shoulders, hands like sandpaper, the kind of man who could fix just about anything with a wrench and a little patience. When the developers showed up in the late 80s wanting to build Maple Ridge Estates, they needed two things that happened to sit on our land: a water line route and a spot for the electrical transformer. Now, Daniel could have told them to get lost, could have forced them to run everything around the property, which would have cost them a fortune. But that wasn't his way. He believed in neighborly deals, handshakes, helping people out. So he let them install the lines across the back corner of our lot. No contracts, no lawyers, just a handshake agreement and a folded survey map he kept in a green metal file box. Long as folks respect each other, he used to say, things work out fine. For 30 years, they did. Then Daniel passed away. Heart gave out one cold February morning while he was clearing snow from the driveway. Just collapsed beside that old John Deere tractor he loved so much, the same one with the bright orange snowplow blade bolted to the front. After that, the neighborhood started changing. New people moved in. Younger crowd. Tech jobs, big money, fancy landscaping companies trimming hedges every Tuesday morning. And eventually, the homeowners association started getting ideas. Now, technically, my property isn't part of their HOA. Never was. Daniel made sure of that when the development plans were drawn up. But the association board still liked to pretend they had some kind of authority over me. Especially the new president. Her name was Vanessa Caldwell. 45 maybe, sharp cheekbones, hair pulled into the tightest bun you've ever seen. Always dressed like she was about to walk into a real estate photo shoot. She and her husband bought one of the bigger lakefront houses 2 years ago, and within 6 months she'd managed to climb her way to HOA president. Some people just love power, even the tiny neighborhood kind. First time she knocked on my door was about a year ago. I remember it clear as day. I opened the screen door, and she was standing there holding a clipboard like it was a badge. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said with that polite smile that never quite reaches the eyes, "I wanted to speak with you about some concerns the association has regarding your property." I leaned against the doorframe and said, "Concerns, huh?" She glanced over my shoulder at the porch swing, the old wind chimes Daniel made, the slightly crooked flower beds along the walkway. "Well, some residents feel the exterior condition of your home may negatively impact neighborhood property values." I couldn't help but laugh. "You mean the yellow paint bothers people?" She blinked once. "It's more about maintaining community standards." "Good thing I'm not in your community then." That was the first crack. After that, she brought it up every couple months. Little comments at the mailbox, polite reminders about upcoming aesthetic guidelines, suggestions that I could voluntarily comply with HOA standards. I always told her the same thing. "No thanks. Most of the neighbors left me alone, though. A few of the older ones even stopped by sometimes. A retired teacher named Paul who lived down the street, a sweet couple in their 70s who'd bring over blueberry pie in the summer. But Vanessa, she never quite let it go. Then this winter happened. Early December, I drove down to Milwaukee to visit my daughter for a few days. My granddaughter had a school play, and I hadn't seen them since Thanksgiving. 3 days. That's all I was gone. When I pulled back into my driveway Sunday afternoon, something felt wrong right away. The space near the garage looked too empty, too clean. For 20 winters, that big orange snowplow blade had been sitting there attached to Daniel's John Deere tractor. Now the spot was bare. At first I thought maybe someone stole it. Then I noticed the tire tracks leading toward the HOA maintenance shed down by the marina. So I walked down there. And sure enough, behind a locked chain gate sat my husband's tractor. Bright orange blade, green body, yellow caution tape stretched across the shed door like a crime scene. And taped to the gate was a laminated notice. Violation of vehicle registration policy. Unauthorized equipment stored in residential driveway. Removal and storage fee, $500. Policy enacted November 8th. The exact day I left town. I stood there for a minute just staring at it. Snow crunching under my boots, cold wind coming off the lake. Then I laughed, because right then I realized something. Vanessa Caldwell had just made a mistake. A very expensive mistake. And she didn't even know it yet. I stood there outside that HOA shed for a long minute, staring at Daniel's tractor sitting behind the chain link like it had been arrested for something. Snow dusted across the hood. That bright orange plow blade still bolted to the front the way he left it last winter. And I swear for a second I could almost hear his voice in my head. Well now, Ellie, looks like somebody's been messing with our stuff. Daniel had a way of saying things like that. Half amused, half curious, never quick to anger. Me, though, I felt something different settling in my chest. Not rage exactly. More like a slow, steady tightening. The kind you feel when you realize somebody just underestimated you. I walked back home without saying a word to anyone. The wind was coming off the lake pretty sharp that afternoon, carrying that metallic smell winter gets when a storm is building somewhere far away. My porch steps creaked under my boots the way they always had, and when I stepped inside the house, the familiar scent of cedar wrapped around me like it had 1,000 times before. The place was quiet, too quiet sometimes since Daniel passed. But that day I had something to do. In the back corner of our hallway closet sat an old green metal file box. Scratched, dented, the kind of thing you might see in a hardware store office from the 1970s. Daniel kept everything in there. Permits, receipts, survey maps, letters from contractors. He was the sort of man who trusted people, but he also believed in keeping records just in case. I carried the box to the kitchen table and flipped the latch. The metal lid creaked open. Inside were folders labeled in his big block handwriting. Roof repair, 1993. Septic, taxes, fence line. Then near the bottom, I saw one I hadn't opened in years. Utilities agreement. I pulled the folder out slowly. Inside was a folded survey map of the original property, yellowed around the edges, along with a single typed letter dated May 1979. Daniel's signature sat at the bottom in thick blue ink. I read it twice, then a third time, and by the time I finished that third reading, I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath through my nose. Well, I'll be damned, I murmured, because suddenly everything made sense. The water line feeding the entire Maple Ridge neighborhood ran straight through the back corner of my lot, exactly where Daniel had allowed the developers to trench it decades ago. And the electrical transformer that powered all 60 homes? That little green box sitting behind a patch of pine trees on the northeast corner of my property, the one everyone assumed belonged to the utility company? That was on my land too. Daniel had allowed it. But here was the important part. There was no formal easement filed with the county. No legal right recorded on the deed. Just Daniel's letter saying the lines could stay, so long as neighborly relations remain respectful and mutually agreeable. Which, legally speaking, meant those lines were there entirely by permission. Permission that could be withdrawn. I sat there at the kitchen table a long time after that, the paper in my hands, watching the snow drift sideways outside the window. Part of me wondered what Daniel would say. He wasn't a vindictive man. He believed in fairness more than anything. But he also had a very simple rule about property. Never let someone bully you off your own land. Eventually I got up, made myself a cup of coffee, and pulled my old laptop onto the table. The letter didn't take long to write. 30-day notice. Formal termination of informal utility access. Effective December 15th. I printed 3 copies. Signed, each one in blue ink. One went into an envelope addressed to the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. Certified mail. Another went back in Daniel's file box. And the third stayed on the kitchen counter, just in case someone decided to come talk. It didn't take long. The phone rang the very next morning. I picked it up halfway through the second ring. Mrs. Whitaker. Vanessa Caldwell's voice came through bright and confident, the way people sound when they believe they're about to win something. I received a rather unusual letter from you. Oh, did you now? Yes, she said, a faint laugh riding under the words. About shutting off utilities to the entire neighborhood? That's the one. There was a pause. Then she chuckled. I assume this is some kind of misunderstanding. You can't simply revoke access to municipal infrastructure. Well, I said calmly, sliding the survey map closer across the table. You might want to take a look at the county records before you say that. Her laughter faded. I could almost hear the shift happening in her head. Excuse me. The water line and transformer sit on my property, I continued. And there's no easement filed, which means they're there by permission. Silence on the other end. Then, quieter now. That can't be correct. You're welcome to check. The call ended a minute later. For the next few days things were quiet, but quiet in that tense way a room gets when people are whispering behind closed doors. By day 7 the HOA lawyer called. Polite man, deep voice, probably used to dealing with parking disputes and fence height complaints instead of this. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, we believe there may be legal grounds to challenge your notice. I'd love to hear them, I replied. There was a rustling of papers. Well, typically utility access would be protected under a recorded easement. Is it recorded? Another pause. No. Then I suppose you'll need my permission. The lawyer cleared his throat. Perhaps we could discuss terms. Not yet, I said. And I hung up. The weather turned colder around the second week of December. 18 degrees one morning. Then 15. Then a stretch where the lake started freezing along the edges. December 15th arrived quiet and gray. At exactly 9 that morning I walked out behind the house where the transformer sat under the pine trees. The county utility crew was already there. 2 guys in heavy jackets who'd read the paperwork and confirmed everything twice before touching anything. One of them tipped his hat politely. Ma'am, you sure about this? I nodded once. He turned a key inside the transformer box. A deep metallic clunk echoed through the cold air. Then the hum of electricity stopped. An hour later the water line valve down by the service trench was closed too. I spent the afternoon baking bread and listening to the wind. Around sunset my phone started ringing again. First Vanessa, then the HOA board, then numbers I didn't recognize. I let every single one go to voicemail. By the second day word had spread across the neighborhood. Cars coming and going. People knocking on doors. Generators rumbling in a few driveways. Day 5 the retired couple down the street packed their car and left to stay with family. Day 7 the HOA lawyer called again, voice tighter now. We'd like to reopen negotiations. Of course you would. What would you require to restore service? I took my time answering that. Because truthfully, this was never about the utilities. It was about something much simpler. Respect. And by the time Vanessa Caldwell showed up at my front door 2 weeks later, she finally understood that. But the look on her face that morning told me the neighborhood had learned that lesson the hard way. The knock on my door came early in the morning. Not the polite kind either. It was hesitant, uneven, like someone who hadn't slept much and wasn't quite sure what they were walking into. I was already awake. Winter mornings tend to do that when you're older. The coffee was brewing. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon toast, and outside the lake looked like a sheet of gray glass under the clouds. When I opened the door, Vanessa Caldwell was standing there. But she didn't look like the same woman who'd shown up with a clipboard the year before. Her hair wasn't in that perfect tight bun anymore. It hung loose around her shoulders like she'd given up halfway through getting ready. Her coat was buttoned wrong, and the skin under her eyes had that pale, sleepless look people get when stress finally catches up with them. She held a folder in both hands. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Cold air drifted between us across the porch. Then she cleared her throat. Mrs. Whitaker, may I come in? I stepped aside and held the door open. She walked into the kitchen slowly, glancing around like someone entering unfamiliar territory. The old cedar cabinets, the worn kitchen table, Daniel's wind chimes hanging near the window. The same thing she'd probably looked down on a dozen times before. I poured another cup of coffee and slid it across the table. She didn't drink it. Instead, she opened the folder. Inside were several printed pages, contracts, I guessed. "We've been reviewing the situation with our legal counsel," she began, trying to keep her voice steady. "The neighborhood has been experiencing significant disruption." I raised an eyebrow. "That's one way to describe it." She pressed her lips together. "You've made your point." That was interesting, because up until that moment, I wasn't sure she realized what the point was. She slid one of the documents across the table. "This is a proposed utilities lease agreement between you and the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. We're prepared to compensate you for access to the water line and transformer." I glanced down. $2,000 per month for water access. $1,500 for electricity. I let out a small whistle. "Well now," I said softly. "That's generous." Her shoulders relaxed a little, like she thought we were nearing the finish line. But I picked up a pen and crossed out the word monthly. Vanessa blinked. "What are you doing?" I wrote something above it. 10-year term. Then I turned the paper so she could see. "First year paid up front," I said. $42,000. She stared at the numbers. "That's significantly more than we discussed." "Well," I replied calmly, "so was confiscating my husband's tractor." Silence filled the room again. The refrigerator hummed quietly behind us. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the porch swing chains. Finally, Vanessa nodded once. "Fine." She reached for the pen, but I gently placed my hand on the paper. "Not finished yet." Her eyes flicked up. I pulled another sheet toward me and started writing. "Since the transformer and water line run across my land, I'll also be approving any landscaping, construction, or digging projects within 50 feet of those utilities." She opened her mouth slightly. "That's going to slow down. Then don't dig near my pipes." She closed it again. I finished writing the clause and slid the paper back. "Anything else?" she asked carefully. I leaned back in my chair. "Actually, yes. There are 3 more things." Her shoulders stiffened. "First," I said, "my husband's tractor gets returned immediately. No storage fees. No fines. Exactly the way it was when it was taken." She nodded quickly. "Done." "Second, the HOA sends me a written apology for removing property that doesn't belong to them." She hesitated there. Pride is a funny thing. You can see people wrestling with it right behind their eyes. But after a moment, she nodded again. "All right." I tapped the pen against the table once more. "And third," she looked up. "Within 48 hours, you resign as president of the HOA." That one hit like a brick. Her face went completely still. "That's not relevant to the utilities agreement." "Oh, I think it is," I said quietly. For a long time, she just sat there staring at me. The kitchen clock ticked softly on the wall. Outside, somewhere down the street, a generator coughed and sputtered. Finally, she spoke. "You're asking me to step down because of a misunderstanding." I met her gaze. "No," I said. "I'm asking you to step down because you treated a neighbor like a problem instead of a person." The words hung in the air between us. Vanessa looked down at the contract again. Her fingers tightened around the pen. I could practically hear the calculations happening in her head. 60 households with no power, no water, insurance companies starting to panic about liability, lawyers running up hourly bills. Power has a funny way of shifting when people realize they don't actually have it. After about 30 seconds, she signed. Once, then again on the second page. The pen scratched loudly across the paper. When she finished, she pushed the contract toward me. "There," she said quietly. I signed my name under hers. That was Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, the bank confirmed the transfer had cleared. $42,000 sitting in my account. Thursday around noon, I heard the sound of a truck pulling into the driveway. When I stepped outside, 2 HOA maintenance workers were carefully unloading Daniel's John Deere tractor from a flatbed. One of them wiped his hands on his jacket and said, "Ma'am, we tuned it up and washed it for you." And I'll admit, that part made me smile. The orange plow blade gleamed like it was brand new. The diesel engine rumbled to life the moment I turned the key. That deep, familiar sound rolled across the yard like an old friend saying hello. Friday morning, a printed notice appeared on the community bulletin board. Vanessa Caldwell had officially resigned as HOA president. No explanation given. Later that afternoon, the new board president called me personally. Young guy named Eric, nervous voice. "Mrs. Whitaker, I just wanted to say, we appreciate your cooperation moving forward." I chuckled softly. "Eric," I said, As long as folks remember where the property line is, we'll get along just fine. That weekend, the first big snowstorm of the season rolled across Maple Ridge. By Saturday morning, the roads were buried under nearly a foot of powder. I climbed onto Daniel's tractor just after sunrise. The cold air smelled like diesel fuel and fresh snow. That sharp, clean scent winter always brings with it. When the engine roared to life, I swear I could almost hear Daniel laughing somewhere. I drove slowly down the driveway, the plow blade pushing snow in wide, curling waves toward the edge of the road. A few neighbors stood watching from their windows as I passed. Some waved. Some looked a little embarrassed. But that's all right. Communities are funny things. Sometimes they forget that the land they're standing on belonged to someone long before the HOA rules and matching mailboxes showed up. And sometimes they need a reminder. Now here's the part I'm curious about. Did I go too far? Some people might say shutting off water and electricity crossed a line. Others might say the HOA had it coming after they tried to push around a 70-year-old widow. So I'd like to hear what you think. If you were in my place, would you have done the same thing? Or would you have handled it differently? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare yourself, I promise you're not the only one.